Hey everyone, Trev here with the Dark Room, and in this video I'm going to be talking about SLRs and rangefinders, what makes them different, why you might choose one over the other based off of your preference, shooting style, or what you like to photograph. This is something we've posted a lot about in the past and have a great blog about it, but I figured we'd make a video and try to put it all in one place. So first off, I'm going to start off with showing you my two favorite SLRs and rangefinders. This is a Nikon FM2, which is an SLR, and this is a Leica M5, which is a rangefinder. I have 50mm lenses on both of these, which is my personal favorite focal length. I'm going to be starting off with the SLR. So SLR stands for single lens reflex, which basically means it has a mirror, and the image, when it goes through the lens, it hits that mirror, which you can see here. There's the mirror that flips up and down. So that image bounces off the mirror, goes into the prism, which is in the viewfinder, and that prism flips the image, correcting it, and then that's what you see in the viewfinder. And basically what that means is what you see is what you get. Framing wise, focal length, depth of field, all of that. And that's a big advantage. Seeing through the lens, that means you can see lens flare, you can see obstructions like a possible finger. It's kind of harder to do with a SLR, but leaves, anything that might be close to you in your way. Framing, it's really helpful with framing and depth of field. So most cameras SLRs have a depth of field preview or DOF, and that's typically right here. And what that means is you see with your lens at your fastest aperture, which this one is 1.8. But say I want to shoot at 5.6 and see what the depth of field is. So I frame, get my focus, and then I hit that, and you can see the aperture blades stop down, and that will show me what my depth of field is going to look like, which is very helpful. Another thing is framing. You know, what you see is what you get, like what I said, and that means if I have a 50mm on, that's what I see in a viewfinder. That's exactly what I'll get. Or say I put a 24mm lens on, I will see 24mm. If I put 200, I'll see 200. And that's not necessarily the case with a rangefinder, which I'll get into in a little bit. With that, with the lens options, there's a little more lens versatility because you can put different lenses on and switch very easily. Also, lenses in general on rangefinders focus closer. So if you're into macro photography, or if you like getting really close to your subject, that's probably something that you might want to consider, because this 50mm 1.8 pancake lens isn't even the closest focus of Nikon 50s, but this is how close I can focus right there. And with my Leica, I'm right there. So you can't get as close focusing wise. And some other things that are advantages about an SLR is typically you have the option of faster shutter speeds. For instance, this camera goes up to a 4,000th of a second. I even have a Canon EOS 3 that goes up to an 8,000th of a second, which is really nice because, like, say you want to shoot wide open at your fastest aperture. Say for this, it's 1.8. I want to shoot at 1.8. I have 100 ISO film. If I have a fast shutter speed, I can do that in bright light and get a good exposure. But I cannot do that with a rangefinder, which typically don't go over 1,000th of a second. Like my M5 only goes to 1,000th, and a couple of my other ones only go up to 500th of a second. So I would have to stop down on my aperture side to get the proper exposure. So that's something to consider. It's not a deal breaker. It just depends on how you shoot. If you like shallow depth of field all the time, even in outdoors, you probably want to go with an SLR that will offer you faster shutter speeds. Some other things about an SLR: they are typically going to be a little bit louder because they have a mirror. And this, I'll let you hear what this sounds like. Actually, I film in it, so I won't take too many of these shots. Okay, right there, here's shutter speed, or shutter sound. The other thing is, since there is a mirror, there's a little more movement in there, and you can't shoot as slow of handheld shutter speeds. For instance, I try to never shoot below a 60th of a second when I'm handheld. Sometimes I'll do a 30th, but it can still be a little bit shaky. Where with the rangefinder, you can shoot at slower handheld speeds. And, you know, typically SLRs will be a little bit bigger than rangefinders, but I don't have the best example of that because I have the largest Leica film rangefinder ever made. The M5 is a lot bigger, but that's not typically the case. Usually SLRs are close to the same size, and typically SLR lenses are larger. Again, that's not the case with this, but that's because this is a pancake lens and it's designed to be much smaller. But yeah, moving on to rangefinders. So rangefinders, you aren't seeing through the lens. That's the biggest difference. You're seeing through an independent viewfinder, and there's a patch right here, and that's how you focus. And that's one thing I actually didn't say about their SLR. When it comes to focusing with SLR, if your subject's in focus, the whole screen will show that, the whole viewfinder. If the subject's out of focus, the whole viewfinder will show that as well. Manual focus SLRs like this will have a split screen focus assist in the middle, but the whole screen focuses, and that's because you're seeing through the lens, which is a big difference from a rangefinder. Since you're not seeing through the lens, you're seeing through an independent separate viewfinder. The only thing that's in and out of focus is a small little patch in the middle. So when you focus, there's a little window here, and it matches up with a viewfinder, and there's an overlap, and that's what you focus on. But the rest of the frame is it's just what you're seeing. It's not in focus or out of focus. It just is what it is. And that's the other thing about that is these have viewfinders that they don't change other than the frame lines. So this specific viewfinder for this M5, the widest it goes by itself is a 35 millimeters. So if I put a 35 millimeter lens on this, it'll just take up the whole viewfinder. I have a 50 on it right now, so that makes smaller frame lines inside the viewfinder. And that is one of the advantages of a rangefinder, especially when you're shooting a 50 millimeter and you have some outside of the frame. You can see things coming and subjects coming into your frame before they get there. So it's easier to predict your subject coming in. And also, since it's not covering your face in your viewfinder, you can look with your eye, which you can't always do with SLRs because they're more in the center. But yeah, so you can see the frame, see your subject coming in, which is nice. And since you're not looking through the lens, when you press the shutter, you don't see the black from the shutter closing because you're not seeing through the lens. When the SLR, when you take a photo, depending on how fast your shutter speed is, there's always a tiny short blackout. So this is just nonstop real life. You're seeing through it, which is really nice, especially depending on what you're photographing. And like if you're photographing in a more interactive way, you can see what's going on a lot more. Some advantages about this as well of not seeing through the lens is filters. So if you put a filter on this lens, it's metering through the lens, and this is a polarizing filter or ND filter, sorry. And so what that means is it'll meter through that, and I'll get the effects of the ND filter, but I won't have to see through it. Compared to with an SLR, I would be seeing through this filter, which would make the viewfinder dimmer and darker. And since I don't have a mirror, the main that affects noise and shutter speed, and that's one of the strengths of this camera and most rangefinders is that they're quiet. So this one's a little more stealthy, has a quiet shutter speed, and you can hear that now. It's very quiet. I can shoot around 1/8 of a second handheld if I'm really steady with this camera, which is something I would never do with my SLR or pretty much any SLR. So you can shoot at handheld slower shutter speeds with this. It's a little quieter. And these cameras typically, especially, you know, like an M6 or something that's a smaller camera, they're typically a little more stealthy and quiet, and you don't notice them as much compared to an SLR. It's a little bit louder. They're typically, oftentimes, a little bit bigger, more noticeable. So that's why these are really great for street photography and just everyday shooting. I personally prefer SLRs or rangefinders just for going out and having fun and shooting, because I like the feel of them. I like the process. I have to think a little bit more about the metering, about the framing and all of that. And with framing, when it comes to lenses, since this is a 35, say the viewfinder, its widest is 35, say I put on a 21 millimeter. This is a 21 millimeter lens. If I mount this on there, that means that my viewfinder isn't showing everything that my lens is seeing. So I'd either have to guess, the focus will still work, but I'll have to guess the framing, or I need a independent viewfinder so I can see what the lens is seeing framing wise and how wide it's gonna be. So that's one of, if you're a wide angle shooter, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a rangefinder. But if you shoot more standard, like 35 or even 28 millimeter, 35, 50, that's great for this. I love 50 and 35. That's pretty much all I'll shoot on this is 35 and 50, where with my rangefinder or with my SLR, I'll change things up a lot more. So when it comes to size, a lot of people say that rangefinders are, smaller, and like I showed you, that's not the case with this, but this is a large rangefinder. There are much smaller rangefinders out there, like for instance the Canonet. The Canon Canonet, this is the QL17G3, which is the last one that was ever made, and this is a great, very affordable rangefinder. I keep messing up, sorry, rangefinder. But while it can produce really good photos, there are some disadvantages of it, and the main thing is that it doesn't have a removable lens. It's fixed. It's a very good lens. It's 40 millimeter, 1.7 leaf shutter lens. It's great results. But if you want versatility, you will need to typically pay more for a rangefinder that has interchangeable lenses, while you can get very inexpensive SLRs with interchangeable lenses and great options. And a good example is, this is a Canon Rebel film camera, and you can buy this camera for $50 or less, and there's a lot of cheap modern day lenses, but then there's Nikon FM. That's a relatively cheap camera, a lot of lens options. So if you're a beginner, I would recommend an SLR, and one of the main reasons is focusing. A lot of beginners, including me still on occasion, can have issues with focusing with a rangefinder, especially if there's a lot of vertical lines or just lines in general. Say you're shooting in woods, or say you're shooting, there's like spindles in the background or stripes or whatever. That single patch that a rangefinder has could line it up, and to you it might look like it's lined up and in focus, but really it's the wrong lines and the whole frame's not showing that, compared to with an SLR, the whole frame is in focus or out of focus, and you can see that feedback, so you don't mess up focus as easily. But with that being said, if you get really good at metering or get really good at focusing with a rangefinder, they're typically going to be faster than a SLR. Like, I know people that shoot with rangefinders that are just very, very fast. So once you get the hang of it, it's really great for focusing. But if you're a beginner, it could be a little bit confusing, especially with cheaper ones, because for instance, this one has a dimmer, not as defined focusing patch as a Leica. So it's a little easier to mess up focusing wise on this camera, but it's totally doable and it's a great camera. The one thing you want to know about some other rangefinders as well is not all of them meter through the lens. The Leica's meter through the lens. This camera meters with that little meter right there, and a lot of other cameras are like that. So just keep that in mind, that the light will affect it in different ways depending on if it's backlit. You need to think a little bit more about that. Another smaller, really tiny, I think this is the smallest true rangefinder made, is an Olympus XA. And this is a true rangefinder. You focus right here. Something to know, if you want to get Olympus XA, only the XA is a rangefinder. The rest, the XA2 and 3 and up, those are all scale zone focusing cameras. They're not rangefinders. This is actual rangefinder. It's very small, compact, and pretty bright viewfinder. I mean, like, it's not bad for focusing. You hit infinity quick, so you know, if your subject's further than 8 feet away, you just shoot it on infinity, which is really nice. In general, if you're into portraits, especially close up or macro photos, anything like that, and if you're looking for a do-it-all camera, one camera, and you want it to be very versatile, I would recommend an SLR. But if you're looking for something that's a little more hands-on, that's a little more sleek and stealthy and quiet, and you do street photography and more everyday life, and you might not be doing close-up stuff or macro stuff or anything like that, a rangefinder might be for you as well. Rangefinders and SLRs create equally beautiful images. I've shot the same film, the same subject, same scenes with both of these cameras, and they're gonna produce pretty much the same results for the most part. It's just the experience and how you do it is a little bit different, and that comes down to your shooting style. So if you have any questions, or if I missed anything in this video, which I probably did, if I missed anything, leave a comment below. Let me know if there's something we missed, we need to address and, you know, post more about, or if you have any questions about what cameras to look at or buy. We would love to help based off of your budget and what's best for you. But anyways, talk to you guys later. Bye.